Water on the front lines of World War II didn't guarantee life. It was a risky bet with fate. That crystal-clear jungle stream was a parasite cocktail that could hollow you out in weeks. The village well, poisoned with corpses by retreating Germans. Even the Army's so-called safe supply reeked of chlorine and metal, so foul that soldiers tossed their purification tablets and drank straight from shell craters instead. Every sip was Russian roulette. Clean water could save you, but the wrong mouthful could kill you slower than any bullet. Under desert suns, in jungle mud, and through bombed-out cities, men fought a second war just to stay hydrated. They boiled water in helmets, strained it through sand and cloth, choked down iodine, or masked it with Kool-Aid packets. Later, the Army rolled out massive purification units that could pump thousands of gallons a day, but those stayed far behind the front. Out here, survival meant turning poison into something barely drinkable. This is how World War II soldiers got clean water on the front lines. Every combat soldier needed at least 4 liters of water daily just to stay conscious. In the Pacific heat, that number jumped to 6. In the North African desert, 8 liters barely kept you vertical. That's over 16 pounds of water per man every single day, in armies that already struggled to carry ammunition and food. And every single natural water source, from Pacific jungle streams to European village wells to whatever passed for water in the Sahara, was contaminated with something that wanted to kill you. The math was brutal and simple. A soldier could survive weeks without decent food, days without sleep, but only hours without water. Your body doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care about enemy positions or supply lines cut by artillery. When your kidneys start shutting down from dehydration, you'll drink from anywhere. Shell craters, animal tracks, puddles that smell like death. Because the alternative is dying right now, instead of maybe dying next week. In the Pacific, every stream carried parasites that could put you in a hospital tent for months. Japanese positions upstream meant human waste in the water supply. Tropical diseases bred in stagnant pools that looked perfectly clear. One battalion on Guadalcanal lost more men to waterborne illness than to Japanese bullets in the first month of fighting. European water sources weren't much better. German forces made poisoning wells standard practice during retreats. Artillery barrages contaminated groundwater with corpses and chemical residue. French and Belgian infrastructure collapsed under bombing, leaving raw sewage mixing with whatever clean sources remained. British soldiers advancing through Normandy found that every well for 50 miles inland had been deliberately fouled. The desert made mockery of the whole concept of water. There simply wasn't any. What existed came from deep wells controlled by whoever held the ground that week, and it usually tasted like sulfur mixed with sand. Australian forces in North Africa reported water that looked like cocoa and tasted worse than medicine. German troops described liquid that required 6 hours of boiling and still came out brown. But here's where it gets worse. Even when clean water existed, getting it to frontline troops meant trucks, drivers, fuel, and roads, all prime targets for enemy forces. Water convoys drew fire like ammunition shipments. German artillery specifically targeted British water points. Japanese forces made destroying Allied water supplies their primary objective after disabling communications. Losing a water truck meant more than losing supplies. It left hundreds of men with no option but to risk drinking dangerous local water or perish from thirst. Military planners had a solution. Halazone tablets, little white pills that released chlorine when dissolved, supposedly turning any contaminated water into safe drinking water in 30 minutes. American soldiers got them in every C ration pack from 1941 to 1945. The tablets worked perfectly in laboratory conditions. They killed bacteria, neutralized most biological threats, and could make swamp water technically safe to drink. Technically safe and actually drinkable were two very different things. Halazone water tasted like drinking from a swimming pool that someone had pissed in. The chlorine smell hit your nose before the liquid reached your lips. Soldiers described the taste as liquid bleach with a side of metal shavings, and the aftertaste lingered for hours, making food taste like chemicals and leaving your mouth feeling like you'd been sucking on pennies. Worse, Halazone tablets had a fatal design flaw. Once you opened a bottle, the tablets lost potency within 3 days. After that, they were useless white powder that still tasted awful, but provided zero protection. In tropical humidity, they degraded even faster. Pacific theater units reported tablets turning to mush within hours of opening. Desert conditions baked them into ineffective chalk. Iodine tablets, introduced later in the war, solved the shelf life problem but created new ones. They lasted 3 months once opened and worked against more biological threats than chlorine. But iodine-treated water looked like weak tea, tasted like liquid metal, and contained visible particles that soldiers called floaties, tiny specks of undissolved iodine that looked like dirt or worse. The taste drove men to desperate measures. Soldiers hoarded flavoring packets from drink mixes, not for variety, but to mask the purification chemicals. Trading ammunition for flavor packets became common in some units. Even when flavoring helped, the psychology remained wrong. Your brain associates bad-tasting liquid with poison. Evolutionary survival instincts that kept humans alive for thousands of years now worked against soldiers who needed to drink chemically treated water to survive. Fighting those instincts while exhausted, stressed, and under enemy fire proved impossible for most men. The Pacific turned water procurement into a gambling game with your life as the stakes. Jungle streams looked clean and cold, but carried parasites that could take weeks to kill you. Rain provided temporary relief during monsoon seasons, but collecting it meant exposing yourself to enemy fire while fumbling with makeshift catchment systems made from shelter halves and helmets. Bomb craters became impromptu reservoirs during heavy rains. Soldiers would race to fill canteens from these artificial pools, knowing the water was contaminated with metal fragments, chemical residue from explosives, and whatever else had been in the soil. But crater water was still preferable to stream water that definitely contained human waste from Japanese positions upstream. The rice paddies of Southeast Asia presented their own horror. Farmers had fertilized these fields with human waste for centuries. The water looked clean, but was essentially liquid death. Soldiers who drank paddy water without purification were guaranteed to get dysentery within hours. Even with chemical treatment, the smell alone was enough to make most men vomit before they could swallow. European warfare brought different challenges but equal danger. German forces made poisoning water supplies standard doctrine during retreats. They dumped anything available: animal carcasses, industrial chemicals, human waste, into wells and streams. When British forces liberated French villages, they often found that every water source for miles had been deliberately contaminated. Urban combat created water nightmares that planners never anticipated. Bombing destroyed sewage systems, mixing raw waste with whatever clean water remained. Artillery barrages ruptured water mains, creating pools of contaminated liquid that looked clean but carried disease from damaged underground infrastructure. Soldiers fighting through cities had to choose between potentially poisoned water from damaged systems or water that was definitely contaminated from natural sources. North African desert warfare reduced water to simple mathematics of survival. Daily rations of 4.5 liters per man meant impossible choices. Half went to cooking and topping off vehicle radiators. The remainder split between drinking and minimal hygiene. Soldiers could either shave or wash their bodies, never both. Most chose neither, saving every drop for drinking. Australian forces reported water that looked like chocolate milk and tasted like sulfur. Wells that provided decent water became strategic objectives fought over as fiercely as ammunition depots. Controlling water sources meant controlling territory. Losing them meant retreat or death from dehydration. While frontline soldiers died of thirst next to contaminated streams, rear echelon units enjoyed sophisticated water purification technology that might as well have existed on another planet. Permanent camps featured liquid chlorine dosing stations with automatic regulators that produced thousands of gallons of perfectly treated water daily. Technical manuals described equipment that could purify anything from swamp water to industrial runoff. The ERD later units represented the pinnacle of military water technology. These mobile processing plants could take contaminated stream water and produce 1,000 to 3,000 gallons of safe drinking water per day. They filtered out silt and debris, neutralized biological threats, and produced water that actually tasted decent. One ERD later could supply an entire infantry battalion under field conditions. But ERD laters were massive, required trucks for transport, needed trained operators, and consumed fuel that frontline units couldn't spare. They worked perfectly for established positions with reliable supply lines. For soldiers advancing through enemy territory or holding isolated positions, they might as well have been science fiction. The gap between what existed and what was available to the men who needed it most revealed the fundamental disconnect between military planning and battlefield reality. Soldiers developed their own purification methods that ignored official doctrine entirely. Boiling remained the most reliable technique, but it required fuel, time, and containers that could withstand heat. Steel canteens worked over open fires. Aluminum held up better than expected. Helmets became emergency boiling vessels when nothing else was available. The 101st Airborne's experience during the Battle of the Bulge illustrated battlefield improvisation at its most desperate. Surrounded by German forces, cut off from supply lines, paratroopers melted snow in their canteen cups to make coffee while dodging artillery fire. They had no purification tablets, no filtering equipment, no official water source, but they had steel cups, small fires, and enough time between German attacks to melt snow. Chemical purification worked when soldiers could tolerate the results. Those who couldn't developed alternative approaches. Mixing treated and untreated water diluted both the taste and the protection. Adding anything with flavor helped mask chemical tastes, but also reduced the effectiveness of purification compounds. Every compromise increased risk while decreasing disgust. Desperation breeds innovation, and World War II soldiers became masters of both. When official water supplies failed and purification methods proved intolerable, men created solutions that kept them alive through sheer ingenuity and willingness to accept risks that would horrify modern safety standards. Gasoline cans became water containers by necessity. The petroleum taste was awful, but it was preferable to dying of thirst or drinking contaminated water. Soldiers learned that gas cans provided protection from biological contamination, even if they ruined the taste. The fuel residue actually helped kill some bacteria, creating accidental purification that was safer than drinking directly from contaminated sources. Buddy washing systems emerged from water scarcity in desert environments. Two soldiers would share a single water bottle for personal hygiene, with one pouring tiny amounts into the other's cupped hands. This technique allowed complete body washing with less than a quart of water. Partners alternated roles, creating a system that maintained minimal hygiene standards with maximum water conservation. Solar heating became standard for improving water palatability without consuming fuel. Clear containers left in sunlight for hours produced warm water that was easier to drink and helped dissolve purification chemicals more completely. Soldiers learned that sun-heated water masked chemical tastes better than cold water, making iodine and chlorine treatments more tolerable. Improvised filtering techniques used whatever materials soldiers could find. Sand from beaches, charcoal from cooking fires, cloth from torn uniforms. Anything that might remove visible contamination got pressed into service. These filters couldn't address biological threats, but they made water look cleaner, which helped psychologically even when they didn't improve safety. Flavor masking evolved beyond official drink mixes to include anything that could improve taste: coffee grounds, tea leaves, fruit peels when available, even tobacco in desperate situations. Soldiers discovered that strong flavors could overpower chemical tastes enough to make purified water drinkable. Trading networks developed around flavoring materials, with men bartering ammunition and supplies for anything that could improve water taste. Both sides recognized that controlling water supplies could determine victory more effectively than controlling ammunition dumps. Water became a strategic weapon deployed through supply line targeting, source contamination, and denial tactics that forced enemies to choose between dehydration and disease. German forces made well poisoning standard doctrine during retreats across Europe. They dumped everything available into water sources: animal carcasses, industrial chemicals, human waste, and captured enemy supplies. The goal was not just contamination, but creating water sources so obviously fouled that advancing Allied forces couldn't even consider using them without extensive purification. Supply line interdiction focused heavily on water trucks and purification equipment. German artillery observers prioritized water convoys over ammunition shipments because destroying water supplies created immediate tactical advantages. Soldiers without water couldn't fight effectively within hours, while soldiers without ammunition could still function for days using captured weapons and supplies. Counter-water warfare became a specialty among combat engineers and special operations units. These teams targeted enemy water supplies with the same precision used against ammunition depots. Contaminating a single well could disable an entire enemy position. Destroying water purification equipment created problems that took days or weeks to solve, compared to weapons that could be replaced from captured stocks. Water denial tactics forced impossible tactical choices on enemy commanders. Units could advance without adequate water supplies and risk losing combat effectiveness to dehydration, or they could slow their advance to secure and purify local sources, giving enemies time to prepare defensive positions. Either choice created vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Strategic bombing campaigns specifically targeted water infrastructure in enemy-controlled territory. Destroying pumping stations, treatment plants, and distribution systems created long-term problems that required massive resources to solve. Repairing water systems took longer than replacing destroyed weapons and had broader impact on civilian populations that might support enemy forces. Allied forces in North Africa discovered that controlling oases and well systems provided more strategic advantage than controlling traditional defensive positions. Water sources became terrain features that determined where armies could operate and for how long. Desert warfare turned into a series of advances from one water source to the next, with the distance between sources determining the feasible speed of advance. Urban warfare created unique opportunities for water warfare. Destroying city water systems affected entire civilian populations, creating refugee flows that complicated enemy logistics and communications. Contaminating urban water supplies with diseases that took weeks to manifest meant that enemy forces couldn't detect the threat until it was too late to prevent casualties. The gap between official doctrine and battlefield reality taught lessons that influenced military planning for decades after the war ended. Soldiers found themselves forced to bend the rules on water purification because the reality on the ground was far different from what military planners had imagined. The psychology of water purification became a central concern for military medical planning. Chemical treatments that soldiers wouldn't use provided zero protection, regardless of their technical effectiveness. Post-war purification research focused as much on taste and appearance as on biological safety, recognizing that psychological acceptance was as important as chemical efficiency. Military engineering incorporated lessons learned from improvised battlefield solutions. Later technology evolved into more portable and fuel-efficient systems. Solar water heating became standard equipment rather than battlefield improvisation. Multiple-stage filtration systems based on soldier innovations were developed into official equipment that could be manufactured and distributed to frontline units. Emergency water procurement became a standard part of military training rather than something soldiers had to learn through trial and error under combat conditions. Training programs incorporated lessons about which improvised sources were relatively safe versus those that carried unacceptable risks. Soldiers learned to evaluate contamination threats and make informed decisions about risk versus necessity. Modern military water doctrine still reflects lessons learned from World War II battlefield innovations. Portable purification systems prioritize psychological acceptance as well as biological safety. Multiple purification options are provided to address different contamination threats and individual tolerance levels. Supply planning assumes that official water supplies will be inadequate or unavailable, and that units must be prepared to improvise. The fundamental lesson remains unchanged. Soldiers will choose survival over doctrine when the two conflict. Water purification methods that can't be used provide no protection. Supply systems that can't reach frontline units serve no purpose. Planning that ignores battlefield psychology and logistical reality creates vulnerabilities that enemies will exploit and soldiers will die from. For the men who fought World War II, thirst was as constant an enemy as hunger or fear. A single sip could mean relief or ruin. Behind the headlines of battles and victories lay this quieter war, a daily fight against invisible killers in every stream, and crater. Improvised filters, harsh-tasting tablets, and boiling water in helmets went beyond mere survival tactics. They became crucial lifelines that carried soldiers forward when all else gave way. Clean water never made it into the war movies, but on the front lines, it decided who marched, who faltered, and who never came home. The story of how soldiers drank is also the story of how they endured. Victory wasn't defined by how many bullets were fired or miles seized, but by every swallow that kept soldiers going.